Liz, 60 seconds, would love your life story.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And it's lovely to be here with all of you today. My life story essentially is I've been in the people space for coming up 20 years, and I love it with a passion. For me, it's about helping people realize their potential. And that's kind of what I got into it for. And that's kind of been a running thread throughout that entire time. So I've worked in a number of sort of sectors, everything from public sector, private sector, higher education, not-for-profit, startup scale-ups. And I'm currently working in a digital scale-up at the moment. And it's which is really designed to help patients proactively look after their health, which I absolutely love. And it's very aligned to kind of one of my values of being purposeful, which I'm very, very passionate about. I'm also a credentialed coach. And again, that sort of meets that need I have of helping people realize potential. So I have a private coaching practice outside of my work with Suvera, which I do part-time. And I think that over the next few years, I can sort of see what I do just kind of expanding, and the fact that I'm passionate about it just hasn't gone away. Don't think it will go away. But I also see myself sort of supporting and mentoring kind of evolving people leaders as well. So that's very, very important to me, that the next generation of people leaders, I'm supporting them to be the best leaders they can be as well.
Thank you so much for joining us. Liz and I worked together a couple of years ago, so I know that we are in very, very safe hands today. But when we think about quiet quitting, and I was kind of Googling a little bit, as I do before all of these sessions, and came across a really, really fun fact about how much time we all spend at work in our lives. And it was close to 85,000 hours, which just feels... But it also then hopefully has been a bit of a kick up the backside for most of us to find roles like you were describing, Liz, that kind of really fill that need for delivering on a purpose and getting joy from what we do. But we can probably all relate to a time where perhaps that spark just hasn't been there, or it's started to fizzle out. And lots of us look for new opportunities and new roles. Some of us don't feel that option is right or available to us. And I suppose that's where we start moving into this realm of quiet quitting. But obviously quiet quitting isn't simply just kind of sneaking up to your boss with a letter and popping it under their door and sneaking out, disappearing into the abyss. So we'd love to hear a little bit more from your perspective about what even is quiet quitting and where's it all come from.
Absolutely. I mean, it is a recently coined phrase, but it's been around much longer than that. Apparently origins are from a Chinese word for lying flat, because I also did a Google and it kept coming, well, it comes from China. I think essentially it's people doing their job and that's it, right? They don't go above and beyond. They don't kind of give any kind of additional discretionary effort to kind of basically going above and beyond to meet their goals and to meet sort of any sort of business objectives. But I think it's important to realize that the lack of engagement, low motivation isn't new to us as people leaders. And obviously it's definitely been exacerbated by the unique circumstances created by the pandemic, where there's been a shift in balance between employees and employers, right? So during the pandemic, we had really, really great employers who did all they could to look after their people, who were dialing up on transparency, autonomy, empowerment, who were looking after their people's well-being, who really understood that there was going to be this tension between kind of work-life balance and that blurring of lines and blurring of boundaries, and that was going to be really challenging and unprecedented. And then you had, the not so great employers who kind of did none of the above. And they were kind of, controlling and monitoring and micromanaging and seeing how far they could push employees before they burnt out, with very, very little disregard for the detrimental impact that would have, or even recognition of the blurring of lines that I mentioned earlier.
It's amazing, actually, if I look back or think back to some of the other sessions that we've had, COVID has come up, I think, in every single session that we've had. When we started the People and Culture Club in the middle of the pandemic, but it's incredible to think how far-reaching the impact of COVID's been. That's obviously been the most recent, I suppose, influencer perhaps to some of this piece around quiet quitting. But what are some of the other factors that you've seen, particularly where you mentioned like lack of engagement isn't a new thing?
So going back to what I said earlier about this not being kind of a new phenomenon, I think we've used different terms to label this in the past, right? And early in my career, we talked a lot about psychological contract, which is that unwritten expectation, that unwritten set of rules between an employee and an employer around, if you come and work for me, this is what I would give you beyond salary and perks and so on, right? I will make sure you grow. I'll make sure you develop. I'll make sure that I look after you, ... Okay. And when that psychological contract is broken, then that's when you start seeing a lot of the hallmarks of what we call quiet quitting, the lack of engagement, disengagement, and so on. So I think for me, quiet quitting came about as a result of that blurring of boundaries that I spoke about earlier during COVID. COVID shifted the balance overnight. Okay. So previously, it felt to me as though we had a little bit more balance between employee and employer. Okay. And that's what essentially the psychological contract does. COVID kind of swept that away overnight. And then that's, I think, why we started seeing a lot more vocalization around kind of quiet quitting, and the instability, the imbalance that was created by COVID went to the core of how safe or unsafe people felt. And it was sustained, right? Absolutely sustained. And it was relentless. And I think a lot of our employees bore the brunt of that. So they were basically trying to do their best in a really unprecedented time. So when you're having sort of employees who are not showing trust, who are trying to control, who are trying to get as much as they can out of people, who have broken that psychological contract, then of course you're going to have employees pushing back, because those boundaries are being strained more than ever. So if you think about how relentless, exhausting COVID was, both for our employees, but I think, let's face it, for us as well as people leaders and people teams. I don't know about you, but the last few years have been some of the most challenging of my career. And I think that if we then think about what it felt like for us, what's it feeling like for our employees, right? So if you're working within a business at a time, during COVID, that didn't give a damn about you, that has the potential to compound the exhaustion, the disengagement, the lack of motivation, and all the other negative effects that come with kind of quiet quitting, essentially.
And we're seeing people talk about this more and more openly, which in one aspect, in fact, actually, I was going to say in one aspect it's great, in another it's not. But actually, I think on balance, it's a really positive thing that people feel that they can open up and raise awareness around feeling things like, I'm feeling disengaged, this is what I'm doing about it. I'm feeling really burnt out. These are some of the things that I'm putting in place. And burnout isn't a new word in tech. I think quite often I hear things like scaling at all costs that kind of gives me a little bit of anxiety. But some of what you said kind of then makes me think about boundary setting. So is quiet quitting just setting good boundaries?
I 100% feel so. I really, really do. So going back to the pandemic, and again, we are going to mention the pandemic a lot because I do think that was the tipping point for a lot of quiet quitting. So if we go back then, boundaries were blurred, as I said earlier, right? Your home became your work and your workplace became your home. And if you think about during lockdown, we could not literally escape work. That's essentially what was happening, right? We couldn't go on holiday. We weren't allowed out more than, an hour a day. I don't know, I've blocked a lot of that time out, but we literally could not escape from our work. So the boundaries, we were living with those blurred boundaries 24/7. So for me, quiet quitting feels like a reaction to that and people trying to firmly reestablish those boundaries, okay? So ultimately, I think it's about trying to redress that balance that I talked about earlier between employees and employers, because let's not also forget some of the negative consequences of the pandemic. Okay, we had companies closing overnight, we had people being made redundant, we had people being sort of furloughed en masse, right? So if you as an employee are one of the lucky ones who kept your job, you are going to hunker down and you're going to do every single thing you can to keep that job, okay? In the midst of all the stuff that's going on around you that feels really, really unsafe. And I think we all felt very unsafe during that time, okay? So, and that went on for a prolonged period of time, that feeling of unsafety, okay? And then once things calmed down, then I think then we started seeing people really firmly pushing back around those boundaries, trying to re-establish them, thinking about, you know what, there must be more to life than this. Think about what's happened globally that's shifted everything overnight. So people are trying to firmly re-establish boundaries between their work and their personal life because their priorities are shifting, their family's priorities are shifting. So I think that quiet quitting is very much a response to that. I can't think of anything else that could have brought this about. I really, really cannot. But people trying to take some sort of control over their lives, over their destinies. I very much feel that's what the core of quiet quitting is.
Yeah, and I can absolutely relate to that. I had a lockdown baby. There's nothing else to do. We couldn't go to Disney World. So we thought, well, if we're going to have another baby, we may as well do it when we can't leave the house. But actually in doing so, I remember being in that dilemma of, well, what do we do? Our eldest went to nursery and my husband, when we had Joey, our youngest, he took shared parental leave for 9 months. I came back to work, and just having the opportunity to come in, do some work in the office, the garage, the office, and go in and have a cuddle and just get to spend a little bit of time with him, and having the autonomy to build my work life. I don't want to say balance, because I think I've not found the balance, work-life integration, maybe perhaps. And I feel very privileged that because I work for myself, I have a lot more autonomy to perhaps be able to do some of those things. But if I was to look to go back into employment, that would be a non-negotiable for me. Absolute non-negotiable. And I can see lots of people nodding. So I know I'm not alone in that, needing that sense of autonomy. And one of the other things that we spoke about last week when we were catching up before this session, and it was related to boundaries, and I suppose this hustle culture that, again, in tech and in entrepreneurship, it's something that we see and hear about quite a lot. And I suppose I'm specifically referring to this 5 a.m. club, which I'm not part of. This morning I think I was part of the 5:38 club when I looked at my phone and thought, why on earth are you awake? It's the middle of the night. And we've seen other things on social media that have come out. Not going to mention names, but we've all got the same 24 hours in a day. Why aren't we all achieving what certain people define as success? So we've kind of got both ends of the spectrum there. And I don't know, is this the end of the hustle culture?
I wish. I so wish. I remember when I heard about the 5 a.m. club, and I remember just thinking, who on earth is doing this? And people are genuinely doing this, right? The worry I have is that leads to burnout, that it's unsustainable, and it's also, and again, and I don't mean to denigrate anybody who does this, but are you really enjoying your life when you're getting up at 5 a.m. and maybe you're then working, I don't know, 15, 16, 17 hours a day? So that's my first thing. Sadly, I don't think quiet quitting is going to see the end of the hustle kind of culture. Your 5 a.m. clubbers, as it were. Just last month, Forbes magazine was giving advice to an aspiring entrepreneur. And one of the pieces of advice I give you, I kid you not, is get up at 5 a.m. and surround yourself with people who do the same thing as you, which is all good and well, but is that really sustainable? And when you as an entrepreneur are trying to build your business, what are you role modeling for the people around you, the people who work with you? So I would say no, I don't think this is sadly the end of hustle culture. There are still a lot of managers, founders, entrepreneurs out there who advocate this, who talk all about work hard, play hard, how fast and how much can I push you? It's not sustainable and it destroys people that it needs to burn out. I've had burnout and it's not fun. The recovery from burnout is brutal and it takes years to recover from. So I think as people leaders, it's important for us, if we've got founders, leaders within our orbit who are doing that, who are role modeling that, who are encouraging other people to do the same thing, I think it would be important to have a sort of a reflection conversation with them about what kind of company, what kind of tone are you trying to set here? Are you trying to burn people out? Are you trying to create a sustainable business that's going to be here for the long term? If you are, then we need to think about the 5 a.m. club or the hustle culture that you want to set for our teams. I think it's also important to realize that there are going to be some sectors where that hustle club mentality is the norm. I'm not going to mention any sectors, I'm sure you can think of some, where it's how fast can we push people? How much can we wring out of them? Which then means you have a revolving door of talent. And sadly, that's still ongoing to this day because you're using and abusing and discarding people. And that, to me, doesn't feel very human. So I do think that quiet quitting is a rejection. It was the start of a rejection of that sort of hustle kind of mentality, although it's right at the other end of the spectrum, right, to the hustle culture theme, as it were.
Absolutely. And I also, one of the things that I talk about a lot, and I know we've had conversations around this before, is this like intention versus impact. And, you know, I'm a big believer that, and I've said this before, 99 point something% of us on this planet are good, decent human beings. And when we're at work, we have the intention of doing good work and doing good things for the people that we work with. That's not always the impact that we have. So there's this kind of awareness gap between the two. And it was really interesting you talking there around as people leaders, and actually really as anyone, kind of holding that mirror up to people if they are part of, for example, pushing this 5 a.m. club. I suppose what we might see more often is the 8 p.m. club, the 9:30 p.m. club, where, you know, we're having been given lots more autonomy over how we manage our days, and we're sending emails out at 8, 9, 10, 11 o'clock. I was coaching somebody the other day and their manager was working abroad for a couple of weeks, which is fantastic, but it meant that emails were coming through in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
And actually, you know, they're going, well, you know, this is fine. I don't expect people to respond. I'm just working at a time that suits me. Intention positive, but actually what is that telling people without telling them if you're working at 8, 9, 3 o'clock in the morning? And perhaps thinking about, if we were all to hold up that mirror, how many of us have perhaps contributed to some of that, totally inadvertently, and whether or not that links into some of this quiet quitting, because lots of the lines are continuing to be blurred.
They really, really are. And just going back to what you said about what are we role modeling for our teams? So I work late. I think most of us as people leaders do. But what I try and avoid doing is sending emails when I'm working late. So I don't know, if I happen to be still working at 8 o'clock at night, then I will schedule emails or Slack messages to go out the next morning, because I do not want to role model that for my team. Even though they might know I'm working, I don't want to shift something onto them and then feel that they then have to respond there and then. I don't ever want that. And I do, and I have in the past encouraged my teams to turn off notifications, to make sure that, you know, when your hours are done, you're done. I don't expect you to respond. I will not respond after certain sort of hours, because I want to role model that for them. I want to role model balance for them. I want them to know that my expectations for them are that when they're at work, I want them to do a really great job. I want to be focused and engaged, and I want them to sort of just feel that sense of impact and purpose. But outside of work, that's your time. I want you to enjoy that time, because ultimately I know that A, that means that you're getting rest and headspace from work, but also B, it means that you're going to have the energy to do great work. So I think it's important that when we're role modeling balance, we're encouraging it, and actually we're talking very, very openly about it. And I think that's one of the best things we can do as leaders, that sounds controversial as a people leader to say this, but quiet quitting in its truest sense is people doing the job that you've hired them to do, full stop. Okay. And there are times when you need discretionary effort from them. And I think it's up to us as leaders to inspire and motivate for that discretionary effort. But that discretionary effort, as far as I'm concerned, should not be 24/7. Full stop. It's unhealthy. It's unsustainable. You're not going to get the best out of people. So what can we do? Make sure that we're encouraging people to do great work when they're in work, smash it when they're in work, and when they're not in work, it's your time, and I need you to take your time and redress the balance and find balance in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And scheduling emails or Slack messages or Google Chats, whatever kind of platforms you're using, is such a simple but effective thing that we can do. And I quite often say it's the simplest things that can have the biggest impact, and some of those really small changes. If anybody is particularly tech savvy and has like a link for those of us that perhaps not quite so tech savvy, which might put myself in that box, on how to do that, I'm sure there'll be lots of us sat here that would love just a quick link on how we can go and make sure that we're all scheduling our messages after a certain time. And it's, you talk about the kind of some people coming into work, doing their 9 to 5, whatever their 9 to 5 looks like, and kind of smashing it at work. And I remember being in kind of performance conversations when I was employed, and we'd be looking at the performance of the team and talking about the difference of those that came in, did their 9 to 5. I think I will tell the story because it's somewhat comical, but I think it also makes an important point. And talking about performance ratings. And I remember that we had a description of, in essence, you have done everything that we expect you to do and we pay you to do. Therefore, your performance is satisfactory. And I remember a certain individual in the senior leadership team said, have you ever been called satisfactory in bed? Because it's not a compliment. And I just thought it made the perfect point that actually the difference between what contractually we are paying people to do versus that psychological contract that you were also talking about, and perhaps expectations that aren't talked about or compensated. Anyway, this is a long way of me saying some people want to come in and do their 9 to 5 and they want to leave and they want to go home and enjoy the things that are important to them outside of work. They don't want to or can't commit to overtime. They're perhaps not looking to progress up the career ladder. They want to be a master of the role that they're in. And they're really, really important people for organisations. So I'd love to know your tips on what we can do to recognise the performance of those individuals too.
I think it's about shifting the narrative on performance, being very, very clear as a business. What does performance mean to you? Because as you say, it's on a spectrum, right? So you've got those people who are quietly smashing it 9 to 5 and that's it. Okay. And it's really, really important to think about, okay, when it comes to discretionary effort, is that part of performance, or is that sort of an added sort of bonus that we will get out of that person as part of the contract of them coming to work for us? I would argue yes. So I think it's important when we're thinking about performance management or performance enablement, performance reviews, we factor that in. If, and again, and I'll put myself in that person's shoes, similar to the situation that happened with you, Ali, right? What do you mean it's satisfactory? I'm literally doing everything you are asking me to do as part of my job description. I'm doing it well. I'm helping the business. I'm enabling the business. I'm impacting. Yes, I can't always do the overtime. Yes, I can't always take on the extra projects. And again, people will have various reasons for not wanting to or being able to. But actually, I'm doing everything you've asked me to do. So how is that satisfactory? So I think it's important we think about how we can shift the narrative. So if somebody is a 9 to 5 or is absolutely smashing it within their role, they are adding value. They're not maybe giving you that discretionary effort sustainably, but they are doing it on occasion. Then I think that to me is somebody who's performing to a good standard, right? And then when we think about some of our high performers who are smashing it on all fronts, who are doing the extra hours, who are taking on the additional projects, thinking about, okay, these are our star performers, and obviously we want to reward accordingly, But I think it's also important to realize that we need both types of people within our organizations. We need the people who can do the doing, quietly sort of smashing it, as it were, who are still impacting in their own way. And we also need sort of those people, those high flyers, who are taking on every single project in sight, because we can't have too many of each, right? It becomes really uneven in the organization. And it's important to think about, how do we recognize that then? How do we make sure that those people who are doing kind of, you know, making more of that discretionary effort are rewarded? And kind of, what do we call that kind of performance even, right? Because I think both are performing. One is maybe adding a little bit more value to the business. So maybe we need to recognize that. But I think it's also important we recognize that the people who are the mainstay and the bulk of our employee base, those 9-to-5ers who would be so termed quiet quitters, are still adding value. And a lot of the time, they're often the backbone of our businesses. And I think we need to remember that. And I think a lot of people forget that. I think the other thing to remember is that when we're thinking about quiet quitting, I think we need to think about it on a spectrum, right? And I think that will certainly help when you start thinking about performance and how you reward people. Okay, so that's where having a really great sort of compensation and pay philosophy comes in. How do you reward people and for what? And that then ties into your definition of performance. And that's important for you as a business to have, because they go hand in hand.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. We talked a little bit about, or I mentioned about this intention versus impact, and could we perhaps be contributing to some of this without realizing? And I'd also like to give most employers the benefit of the doubt. I think there are perhaps a couple of people that are very vocal on social media about how they want to run their organizations. But the very vast majority of them, the intention is there to create great places for people to work, where those individuals can thrive and do great things for the business. But clearly, the evidence is pointing to lots of employers perhaps are getting this wrong, or not being as effective as they would want to be. Yeah. What impact is quiet quitting having on organizations?
Oh, Lordy. Again, I think looking at quiet quitting on that spectrum, if you have somebody who is, as I mentioned earlier, coming in, doing their 9-to-5, quietly smashing it, doing a really, really, doing a solid job for you, keeping the lights on and so on, then I think it's important to realize that they are still impacting the organization in a positive manner, but in a slightly different way to kind of your so-called high performers. Okay, so they're going to be occasionally engaged. They're going to be kind of motivated enough to do that sort of day-to-day job. They're doing their job essentially with boundaries in place, and it's up to us, I think, as leaders to understand what matters to them and what will intrinsically motivate them to dial up their levels of engagement and motivation, so you can get a little bit more out of them. Okay, because I think left unchecked, you are then going to be having people who are moving from quiet quitting into loud quitting, right? I think that they could potentially become demoralized, unhelpful, unproductive, disruptive. And then we're kind of leaning into underperformance, which means that, as people professionals, we're going to have to be spending time and energy and resources to address that. Okay. So I think of quiet quitting as an opportunity to gain more insight from your employees on the things that matter most to them, so you can actually do something proactively about it.
Yeah, absolutely love that. And it really makes me think of Dan Pink's framework around drive and being able to find that overlap between having purpose, autonomy, and mastery, and how we explore those with our teams. And it doesn't have to be necessarily a, hey Liz, what motivates you? No, but just asking people questions like, how can I get the best from you? Where do you do your best work?
Yeah.
What tips do you have, particularly as a coach? And I know this is one of your real strengths. What advice do you have for some of us having those conversations with our teams that will help us explore what people's motivations are?
So in addition to the questions that you've just shared, one of the ones I love using, because sometimes people don't always know kind of what's important to them. So one of the questions I ask is, in a previous role, what has a manager done that has really kind of you found challenging and really demotivated you? And again, there's a lot you can take away from that. Okay, great. So, and then what were they doing that you really, really kind of thought, this is helping me thrive. This is helping me grow. This is adding to my experience with this company. What were they doing? Again, see what comes out. So if, for example, the response is they were giving me the ability to work on projects autonomously. Okay, great. Okay, autonomy clearly seems to be something that's important to you, because I could see you got energized by that. They were giving me the opportunity to present at sort of leadership meetings, to come in and present on particular projects. Okay, so you want accountability, you want responsibility, you want work that's going to help you raise your profile. So, okay, I understand that now, which means that I need to think about ways that I can give that to you, because I know that that's going to motivate you to do more. So once you ask those questions, it's important then to start thinking about, how can I make this much more tangible? What can I do to give that person more of that? And also then thinking about the things that demotivated that person, didn't enable them to thrive, really reflecting on if there's anything you're doing as a leader that actually could be challenging or blocking them to be successful. Ultimately, we want our people to be successful, right? No one, no boss, no company wants to bring people on board, spend that time and energy to bring people on board, and then just leave them to it. And sadly, a lot of companies do that. So it's really, really important that for companies, but also for the leaders of people, to really, really understand, how can we get the best out of them when we have them? How can we make sure they have the best experience while they are with us? One day they will leave us, right? They're not going to stay with us forever. But do we want them to leave with with a positive sort of message to share with the world about us and their experience, or something a little bit more negative? So I think it's really, really important to think about, what does that experience look like?
Exactly, yeah. And you mentioned there about onboarding too, and I suppose that plays a really important part of that kind of psychological social contracting that we do, and particularly if we're kind of zoning in on those that are in startup or starting to scale, the role that they join on might look very, very different 12 months down the line. But also kind of some of those questions that you were sharing there about really helping to tap in to somebody's motivations. It makes me think around kind of readmes and taking the time to best get to know other people's working styles. What's your take on readmes, and perhaps a quick introduction to what they are if anyone's not familiar?
Yeah, love readmes. So I'm 4 months into my new role with Suvera, and the first thing I did is for the rest of the leadership team was, in my first 8 weeks, we went for an offsite, and I asked everyone to do a readme as part of one of the offsite activities. A readme essentially is a manual of me. It's helping other people understand who I am as a human being at work, what stresses me out, how to get the best out of me, how I like to communicate, my communication do's and don'ts, essentially, how I like to give feedback, how I like to receive feedback, what I look like under stress, so that you can recognize when I'm under stress and how you can support me. And then it's really important, certainly for me with my team, that we also kind of make the readme a little bit more personal. So I invite people to share random things about themselves and their personality and the important sort of people and things in their lives. And what that does is it sort of helps us all realize we're all human. We all have lives outside work, and it helps to build connection. So readmes are really a fabulous, fabulous way to just help teams and managers and employees get that little introduction, that little window into who the other person is. Although it's just the start. You can't just do a readme exercise, read it, and then stop. You have to keep continuing to kind of peer in to find out a little bit more about that person, and give them the opportunity to do the same with you. Because I always encourage managers to do readmes as well, because they are incredibly helpful for their direct reports.
They really are, and it's such a great team building experience. And it's such a simple exercise, but the amount of times I've had people go, I just didn't know that about you. Yeah. That's really, really interesting. And some of those kind of really nuanced things, like, I work 5 days a week. perhaps working more than I would like to at the moment. But one of those boundaries I've put in place is I will do the school run, and I will do the school run 4 days a week. So therefore, I do not accept meeting invites unless they are essential before 9:30, so that I have that opportunity to spend time with my son. But it feels quite abrupt to say that the first time you meet someone, by the way, please do not book a meeting in at before 9:30. But by having this read me, and by it being an exercise about sharing what's important to us and how to get the best from each other, just seems to really aid some of that social contracting.
Exactly. This is what it is, right? And it means that people aren't going in cold, and people understand the why behind this, the way you might behave at work, or the way you might react to something that occurs in the workplace. It's a really simple but very, very powerful tool.
Simple but effective. I've just seen on the chat, Auntie, thank you for sharing the link on how we can all schedule our emails. That's fantastic. Thank you. We're going to come to some questions fairly shortly. So if you've got questions for Liz, please do pop them into the chat, and we'll come to them shortly. If we zone back out, and we've kind of delved into motivation, and if some of us are sat here kind of asking the question, well, is quiet quitting, I say an issue in inverted commas, but is this something that's going on in our business? What are some of the signs that we can look for, both at an individual but also an organizational level?
No, of course. So if we think about an organizational level, sort of some really good signs to look for include, if you've got the same problems occurring again and again and again, whether they're process problems, people problems, workflow problems, all the above, with very little resolution, that's certainly a big red flag for me, because it's telling me that people don't care enough to resolve them, right? If something's happening consistently, you will be thinking, okay, why has nobody picked that up? So I think that's a really important sort of red flag for you to pick up on. Is there increased sustained conflict between teams or individuals, or between managers and their direct reports? Again, I think that's a really, really dead giveaway, because there's going to be a lot of challenge, a lot of pushback. Is there a sort of them versus us mentality between teams, or even within teams, or between managers and teams? Are you seeing a drop in engagement levels in employee surveys with very little improvement, or with a marked decline? Are your customers complaining more? Are you getting sort of lower eNPS scores or NPS scores from your customers? Have you noticed that there's more siloed working, because people really just don't want to cross collaborate, because they literally just want to do their job, and they don't care about sort of collaborating or what other people think, and so on. So I think those are quite sort of big and noticeable red flags. I think if you then take it sort of a step sort of down, looking at an individual sort of level, I think for a lot of leaders, it's really, really important to look at if somebody's being less participatory in meetings or in discussions, if they are being less sort of engaged, they're taking part in less sort of socials, whether that's in real life or virtually for a lot of our hybrid or remote first teams. Has there been decreased sort of communication from that individual? Is there also sort of a decrease in constructive challenge? And that's important, because people challenge when they care about something, or constructively challenge when they care about something. If they don't care about something, they're not going to challenge it. So if people are speaking up less about this sort of stuff, that to me is a really big flag. Is somebody showing less energy for their work? That's a really, really important one. If in one-to-one, somebody's telling you consistently, do you know what, I'm really quite tired, or I'm not sleeping well. Okay, what's going on here? Is there increased sickness absence? Again, that's a really big giveaway. If somebody's sickness absence goes from 0 to sort of pretty high. Is somebody not speaking up when things go wrong? Because again, they just simply care less. Okay, so it sounds simple, but when you kind of fit all of these pieces of the jigsaw together, it's telling you that potentially there's going to be some issues, either organizational wide, or in certain pockets of the organization, or with certain individuals.
So some of us are sat here thinking, you know what, some of what you just said, Liz, is ringing a few bells or a few alarms for me. There's been some really great tips about what we can do at an individual level, but if we think there's perhaps something more systemic going on, where do we start?
Yeah, okay. So I came up with this model called CARE. So as employers, I think it's important we show some care. And CARE stands for, the C stands for literally care. The A stands for asking, so getting some insight from people within the organization. The R stands for recognition, and the E stands for engaging and educating managers. So I'll go through them, I'll break them down a little bit further. So in terms of when we're talking about care, it's important as leaders to understand what employees need to keep motivated at work, right? Caring enough to find out, to understand, right? Getting to know our employees, showing interest by literally being human first, right? So relating on a human to human level. If someone's telling you in a one-to-one that they're having a really hard time at home or really hard time at work, you know, not ignoring it, but listening, literally leaning in, listen, show empathy, ask them what you could change, what support they need at work, signposting kind of any forms of support that they can access, whether it's an EAP or if you've got, like we do at Suvera, like access to mental health sort of coaching, therapy, making sure that you are showing them that you care, right? Check in with them, reassure them, show you've got their back. Don't just leave them floundering in the wind. I think that's a really, really important thing. And I think a lot of organizations, sadly, they think that almost caring isn't their responsibility, and I would argue that it is. Okay, so these are human beings we're dealing with. So let's start by showing that care. In terms of that A, you know, asking them, getting some insight from them, you know, asking, you know, some of the questions that I shared earlier. Additional ones could be, you know, what are we as a company doing right now that makes work challenging for you? Or flipping it on its head, what are we as a company doing really well right now? And if they can't tell you, then that in itself says a lot. That is very, very telling. Okay. And whatever you hear, whatever insights you get, it's so, so important to do something about it. I know we all know this, right? We get, you know, we send out engagement survey, we get the feedback from our teams, and then nothing happens. And that is very, very demoralizing. Okay. Because not acting reinforces that individual's reasons for quiet quitting. People here don't care. I don't feel valued. I don't feel seen. I don't feel heard. Okay. And then when we think about the R and that sort of recognition piece, thinking about the kudos that you can give for the achievements that people actually make in their sort of day-to-day work. This is where it really pays to know your team, because one of the things I love to do is personalize kudos and recognition, because if somebody doesn't like being publicly recognized, then I'm going to avoid doing that at all costs. If somebody really enjoys that, then I want to dial that up. Okay. Really trying to understand what's intrinsically motivating for your team. Yeah. And don't forget to celebrate your company achievements. Don't forget to recognize them, because that's a really, really great way to reinforce why you're all there doing what you're doing, which can then help to sort of bring about that sense of purpose and that sense of, okay, there is something, I'm here to have some sort of impact, and I can see it because I can see that we are making those marked improvements or we're achieving those goals. Okay. And then when we're thinking about that E, which is around sort of engaging and educating your managers are going to be absolutely key, I think, for helping you on this journey, because we need to educate them to recognize the signs of quiet quitting. So some of the stuff that I've shared with you previously. So taking them through that list, getting them to reflect on if there's any kind of body in their team who is kind of showing those signs. Okay. Because if they know the signs, they can do something proactively about it. Because by the time we as a people team get involved, it's far, far too late. And it means that can lead to a much more negative outcome than you would have had if a manager had recognized the signs, proactively sort of done something about it earlier on. Okay. And I think it's really, really also important that your managers aren't quiet quitting. I think that there's nothing worse than a manager who's just completely they've left, the lights are on, but you know, the lights are on, but they've completely left the building, right? Yeah. So I think it's important to make sure that we're giving them the skills in this kind of brave new world of remote and sort of hybrid working, where they're not seeing their teams every day, right? So if we can give them the skills, we're developing them, we're empowering them, we're enabling them. So let's do what we can to give them that sense of, I've got this, and support them where we can. Okay, so for me, it's super simple. It feels super simple, but I think that that can be a very, very, very powerful thing using that model, the care model. Okay, so show you care, ask, get some insight, and then do something about it when you get that insight. Recognize, give kudos, try and personalize it if you can, to show that somebody feels seen and heard, and then thinking about how you educate and how you actually engage with your managers.
Love that. Super simple care. I think the education piece really kind of hits home for me. The care piece feels like the intention. Get your intentions right.
Yeah.
But it's that education piece that's going to enable that impact to be in line with the intentions. And when we look at kind of high performance leadership programs and how do we equip our leaders, so often that budget is reserved for senior leaders, or the budget for first time, second time managers is much smaller. There's less to play with. But actually, I'm a big believer that when we don't feel confident in the work that we're doing, we don't feel as psychologically safe. The research suggests that when we don't feel as psychologically safe, we're less likely to be a high performer. And yet we can have such an impact, positive or negative, with those that we work with.